put that note to the side, and we'll get to those next week. But I want to discuss here the verse 11. Verse 11, when you look here in verse 11, woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain. They've gone in the way of Cain. And who is he discussing here? Those that have left the faith, those that have rejected the blood of Christ, these apostates that have been mentioned and has been discussed thus far in this book or this epistle of Jude. The way of Cain. What does that mean? Woe unto them. They've gone in the way of Cain. And so I want to look at that account that's given to us, the way of Cain. Does anybody remember a very famous verse that we often teach our children in the Old Testament, in the book of Psalms, when discussing the way? Any verse come to mind? What about the very first verse of the very first chapter? Go with me to Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. We're looking at the way of Cain. It says, woe unto them because they've gone in the way of Cain. Well, what way is that? What does that look like? We're going to go refamiliarize ourselves with the account of Cain and Abel. But the way is also mentioned here in Psalm chapter 1, verse 1. Blessed is the man that walks in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. All right? The way of Cain. Now let's go to Acts chapter 14, verse 16. If you would go, Acts chapter 14, verse 16. We're talking about the way. What is the way? What does it mean by way? We're going to read a few more verses here, then get to this understanding. Chapter 14, verse 16, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Ways. All right, now let's go to Proverbs chapter 14, verse 2. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 2. We've often used this in our modern day vernacular. You say, well, that's just the way they are. Or that's their way of doing things, right? And so we kind of use this in today's vocabulary. And let's look at Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. Can somebody read that for me? Yeah, go ahead, Bob. Read verse 12.
There is a way which seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death.
All right, so here it is again. The way. A way. What does that mean? And now we look at Jude chapter 1, verse 11, and it's saying, woe unto them, they've gone in the way of Cain. Well, when we think about this, we say it, like I said, in our modern language. This isn't something that we've drifted, that has changed throughout time. We do talk like this today. Way. It means this: a continued or habitual course of conduct or pattern of thinking. Or pattern of thinking. So we say, that's just the way they are. That's the way they operate. That's their pattern of thinking. That's their continued habitual course of conduct. That's how they act, right? So when it says here, they've gone the way of Cain. They've drifted in the pattern of thinking, the operation to which Cain conducted. That's what these apostates, that's where they've gone. So we have to ask ourselves, okay, the writer of Jude is saying they've gone in the way of Cain. They've gone towards that pattern of thinking, that pattern of operation to which Cain conducted himself with. So what does that mean? So how did Cain conduct himself? Let's all go back to Genesis chapter 4 and refamiliarize ourselves with that old account given to us of Cain and Abel. These apostates, they've gone in the way of Cain. Genesis chapter 4, verse 1 through 15. I'll read this account for us. Chapter 4, verse 1 through 15. And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering. But unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth? And why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. And unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. And Cain talked with Abel his brother. And it came to pass, when they were in the field, that Cain rose up against Abel his brother, and slew him. And the Lord said unto Cain, Where is Abel thy brother? And he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? And he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Now, we see this in part. Let's couple it with what the book of Hebrews says. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. So we have the account that we read there in the book of Genesis, and there are other occasions in the Bible to which this account is brought up in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. Okay? Jude says, Woe unto them, they've gone after the way of Cain. Their pattern of thinking, their way of operation, their mindset, their course of action is just like that of that Old Testament account in Cain. What does that mean? What does that look like? We read the account. Abel brought an acceptable sacrifice. Cain brought what he thought should have been accepted, but was not. It goes back often, when we look at the account of Cain and Abel, you have religion often recognized in the giving of Cain, and you have faith replicated in the giving of Abel. You say, what do you mean by religion? Works. I often say this, and when you go back and hearken back to the account of Cain and Abel, which would have taken maybe of more effort? You think planting the seed, cultivating the ground, weeding the ground, plucking and harvesting of that. Now, some might argue that the raising of a sheep might just be equally as difficult. I've never raised a sheep. Is it difficult? I don't know. Artie. Leave it to Artie. Here we go. But oftentimes, Cain is recognized as one of religion, formalities. He thought it would be acceptable. So many times we look at worship and say, well, God accepts this, doesn't he? Well, what did God say? What did God say? What was acceptable in the eyes of God? And here's the other thing that we often neglect to see. God says, look, what have you done? Or not, let's go back to it. Genesis chapter 4, verse 7. I think this is an amazing account in the graciousness of God. I believe it shows His grace. I believe it even shows His long-suffering. In verse 7, Cain gives his giving there of his fruits and that of the garden, and Abel gives that of his firstlings. One was accepted, one was rejected, but in God's graciousness, He extends to Cain in verse 7, if thou doest well, thou shalt thou not be accepted? Cain, if you just would listen, Cain, if you would have just done what I'd said, Cain, if you would have just acted in faith like your brother, and not done things in your own way, wouldn't it be accepted, Cain? Wouldn't I accept you just the same as I would have Abel? Go ahead, Dean.
In other words, there's an argument for that. Why should he have to go buy a sheep from Abel and kill a sheep? He didn't have any sheep in his hand.
Mm-hmm.
But as I look at that verse, the word chatah
Mm-hmm.
is in Leviticus as a sin offering.
Mm-hmm.
So he rejected the remedy for his old nature and rejected Jesus Christ at the same time.
Right.
And a lamb was given.
Yeah. So when I look at this passage, like you said, Dean, some people will say would have been fair. To me, when I look at it, obviously there was an understanding of what should be sacrificed, what would be acceptable, right? How that would have came to pass in that time between verses 1 through 3, and that time between verse 3 and verse 4, how that came to the knowledge of both Cain and Abel, what would be accepted and what wouldn't. But at the same time, Cain would have used what he had tilled from the ground to purchase. So it still would have been labor. It still would have been sacrifice. It would still have been a proper thing to do, in my mind, to purchase that which was required for sacrifice. Sure. In the Garden of Eden, yes.
That lamb was at the door. I don't see it as Satan. I see that he didn't deal with his own nature with the sin offering.
Right.
And he rejected the Lamb of God.
He rejected. So what Dean is saying is when you look at that rejection of buying that lamb, which the lamb is what? A picture of Christ, right? So he rejects the purchase of that lamb, and that sacrifice is the rejection of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm.
And it was a free gift. It
Mm-hmm.
didn't cost him anything.
Okay.
I'm sorry I get very deep into this because it's so hard to get Muslims to say I have sin.
Mm-hmm.
That I work a lot on that doctrine.
Okay.
So I see it as a free gift right at the door, and he rejected that lamb.
Yep. That's good, Mike. You were going to add to that?
Well, if you continue reading, what God tells Cain could be a curse, but I don't see it as a curse, as you keep going your way, and your toil means nothing. You'll lose ground going away from me. Right? The earth will not yield its fruit
Mm-hmm.
like it did before. If you keep doing it your way instead of the way that I instruct you, it's frustration.
Right.
It's toiling, but you're getting nowhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and so we know the account here as it's referenced, to Mike's point, you continue to do things your way. We still have this problem today. Now, as it pertains to Jude, those apostates that we're looking at, these teachers, right? They're teaching a false gospel, teaching you can do it your way. You can work for it your way. You can, just as long as you be a good enough person, just as long as your intention is right, just as long as you're, just as long as you, quote unquote, meant well, then you're good. That's what we often see when it's recalling the account here of Cain and Abel. Religion versus faith. People trying to get God's acceptance by way of a checklist versus a faith in the blood of Jesus Christ. All right, faith in the Lamb, right? That was the point of the sacrifice that Abel did give, was that it was a faith in the blood or in the Lamb that was to be offered, right? And so we see here that is the way That is the thinking of these apostates, that they can do what they want and God will accept it. And God will accept it. Once again, cloaked in Christian terms, in good vernacular, and maybe there might even be a book about it, right? Might even be a bestseller, right? But it doesn't mean anything, right? It's empty. It's vain. It's the wrong way. And so we see here, Abel believed God. We know that because of Hebrews. He believed God. He believed what he had been taught. He trusted God for what he had been taught. And he gave what he had been taught. Now when it comes to Cain, he didn't. Cain offered, yes, but faithlessly. Not by faith, by his own works. You see, works in Cain and faith in Abel. The apostate, they've gone in the way of Cain. They've gone to the works aspect, to the religious aspect. That's how we get to heaven. Dean, go ahead and finish.
A shepherd lives off the sheep. He doesn't work, the sheep will do the work.
Okay.
And so that was a free gift to him, that sheep that he offered. It was a free gift. And that's what salvation is, a free gift.
Yeah. Now, when we talk about the way, let's look here back at Cain. Cain didn't accept this belief. That he didn't trust God and what his word. He did his own thing. He worshiped his own way. And so when we talk about the way, I want to call out a couple things. I want you to notice here when it comes to the way of Cain, it's the way of hypocrisy. You see, by faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. Cain offered faithlessly. Faithlessly. There was no faith in that. He tilled it, he gave it. So we see the way of hypocrisy. His words didn't align with his offering. His actions didn't align with his offering, or I guess you should say it did align with his offering, but not for the teaching to which he had experienced. You see the way of selfishness. You look here, when we go back to the account of Cain and Abel, you see, Cain, what have you done? Where's your brother? What was his response? Probably one of the most quoted by the world verses, right? There's a couple of them here. Am I my brother's keeper? Selfish. The way of selfish. So when it says they've gone the way of Cain, they've gone the way of hypocrisy, they've gone the way of their own actions, that everything's just acceptable. They've gone the way of selfishness. They've gone the way of envy. There's no doubt, look, in verse 7 of chapter 4, God offers to Cain, he tells Cain, Cain, why are you wroth? If you would just bring the right offering, would I not accept it just as I did Abel's? You see that extension there. I see it as God's grace, as his long suffering to say, Cain, look, just do what I've said. Follow after my word. Right? You don't have to add to it. You don't have to change it. And we see here I believe you can see this great animosity, great envy between Cain and Abel. So much so that they're in the field. Cain rises up against his brother, kills him. And when God comes, it's not as if he really was inquiring where Abel was at, right? He knew exactly what had happened. He knew that the blood of Abel was crying out, right? It's just like a parent when we know what happened, but we talk to the kids and get them to tell us what had happened, right? We see that happening here, right? We see the way of selfishness. We see the way of envy. Yeah.
Another way I see from the works of Islam, they carry the sin of bitterness. Like when I witness to them, I can sense bitterness coming out of them. And then I have to check myself because it could come out of me. And so that's a sin that he was burying himself in that bitterness too. And it sprang out into murder.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to Dean's point, he's saying that bitterness, that anger, that wrath that to which Christ, our God calls out here. Why? Envy, jealousy, right? And I believe it to be jealousy because the way verse 7 is worded by God. Look, go back and read verse 7. If thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? It's like, look, if you do right, Cain, you'll be accepted like your brother. So to me, the point of contention here was that Abel was accepted and his wasn't. So he wasn't mad at God, he was mad at Abel. And unto thee shall be his desire. And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. Okay? And so we see the way of hypocrisy, the way of selfishness, the way of envy, the way of judgment. Right? Woe unto you. So we see here when Jude is describing the way of Cain, these apostates, they've left the Word of God. They've rejected the blood of Christ and gone the way of Cain, the way of selfishness, the way of envy. We see it all around us today. We see it with quote-unquote Christianity, the quote-unquote teachers. And so they have left that way. Then that leads us into the second one. Let's read verse 11. Go back with me to Jude chapter 1. Jude, verse 11.
To them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam.
I like, there's a really interesting word here. I don't know if you catch it. It doesn't say that they ran greedily. It doesn't say that they it doesn't say they went after or fell after or walked after. It says they ran. When they ran after the error of Balaam. They didn't hesitate. They went, and they went fast. So we see here, woe unto them, for they have gone the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam. What is that error? We talked about Cain and Abel. Now we move to Balaam. Balaam. Numbers chapter 22 is where we'll go here in a minute. When you say error here in Jude chapter 1 verse 11, the error of Balaam, you have the way of Cain, right, which was his thinking, his pattern of how he processed and thought. When it comes to Balaam, it's not the way of Balaam, it's the error of Balaam. It's different. So as a pastor, I'm looking at this and drawing up my outline. He didn't say the way of Cain and the way of Balaam. He says the way of Cain and the error of Balaam. They ran after the error of Balaam.
God had chosen Israel, and Balaam used different techniques to destroy Israel.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he greedily and quickly ran after the wrong direction.
Right.
The boldness going.
So when we look at error, what that means here in this context is that when he ran after the error, when they run after the error of Balaam, they forsake of the right path. That's what that word error means, a forsaking of the right path. It wasn't a casual thing. They went against the right path. They did it, and they did it quickly. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15 and 16. You can hold numbers there. We're going to read a couple verses or a verse before we get there, or two.
Where are we going?
2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15 and 16. Remember what I was saying. Remember how 2 Peter and Jude are very close. 2 Peter's prophesying of the apostate. Jude is describing the current state of the apostate, okay? And so, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 15 through 16, which have forsaken the right way and gone astray, following the way of Balaam, the son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. Did you get that? He loved the way of unrighteousness, but was rebuked for his iniquity. The dumb ass speaking with man's voice, forbade the madness of the prophet. They've gone the way of Cain. He's ran greedily after the heir of Balaam. Did Balaam know the truth? Did he know the truth? Yes. Rejected. He knew the truth and rejected it. Why? I think you look here in 2 Peter, he loved the way of unrighteousness. It had such a hold on him, had such a draw, had such a grasp. He loved it. He loved it. Balaam is that example of a false teacher who becomes worldly, seeking possessions. He becomes infatuated with acceptance. He becomes just overwhelmed with the worldly things. So much so that he leads God's people into sin. He leads God's people into sin. Now, I'm gonna read. We're gonna wait and read the account in Numbers chapter 22 next week. But I want you to go to Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. Do you remember another verse in Jude where it says they've turned the grace of God into lasciviousness? That's Balaam here. They've abused it for their own gain. That's their way. That's their way. Is this important for us today to be learning this? I think so, because we need to be aware of what's around us. We need to be aware of those that have crept in unawares, right? So let's go to Revelation chapter 2, verse 14. But I have a few things against thee. Because thou hast there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast the stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed unto idols, and to commit fornication. What a terrible way. I mean, the doctrine of Balaam was to profit in whatever way he could. Whatever way he could use his position, whatever way he can use his authority to gain for himself. At the expense, that's the error of Balaam. They run toward this at the expense of God's people. Now couple that with 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2. They went in the way of Cain, right? Religion. They not of faith, but by a series of checkboxes and faithlessness. And they ran after the greed like Balaam, the greed of Balaam. 1 Peter 5:2, feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind. Not of filthy lucre. Right? As a leader, as a teacher, as a pastor, I don't do this with the intention of getting rich. Right? It was a way of Balaam. He abused the office. He abused the power and the position. And that's what these apostates run after. Right? They run after that worldliness. They love it. They run after the name and the neon letters. The heir of Balaam. Next week we'll get into the rest of that account, and then also we'll couple it with the gainsaying of Korah. So it's interesting. Look at the progression here. They went after the way of Cain, right? The grammar here, and ran greedily after the heir of Balaam for reward. They did it for the reward of it. And then ultimately, you see the progression here? And they perished. They perished in the gainsaying of Korah, right? So it's a progression. We'll finish this out next week maybe as we look at it.
On that last one, I know
You're going to get into Korah this week, Mike?
But,
He said, I can't help it.
you know, it's almost like a meme where, you know, Sunday dinner after church, people have those asters.
People what?
Have you ever heard that saying?
I didn't hear what you said at the end part.
after church. It's almost like a meme, where people have roast pastor.
Oh, roast pastor. Yeah, roast pastor.
Right,
For lunch. That's Cora. That's Cora.
That's Cora.
Yeah,
Cora.
that's the Cora part. Yes, Dean.
I got a knock, knock, knock,
Okay, what is it, Dean? Knock, knock.
pastor,
Pastor who?
pass the potatoes, please.
Oh, pass the potatoes, please. There you go. I like it, Dean. Hey, I do want to say this is important here in Jude. Why? Because we need to know the characteristics. We need to know what these people are about. Look, not everybody that comes and says they're a believer, says they're a teacher, says they're a man of God, just because they say it doesn't mean it's true. What are their works? What is their fruit? What are they following after? I believe this is important because we live in a society where we're so connected and you have the ability just to turn on the radio and hear. And let me just warn you, just because you hear them on the end of that radio doesn't mean what they're saying is worth anything. Just because they're a big name and going to come sell out an arena over here doesn't mean anything, right? And so we are challenged by the Word of God to examine them, to try the spirits, to look at their fruits, right? Because they are out there. That's what Jude's about. They are out there. You might be inviting them into your church. It might not be by way of a pulpit, but it might be by way of recommending a book, recommending a song, recommending a sermon, right? We have to be aware. Why? Because what is their goal? Their goal is for self-gain at the expense, many times, of others, right? And so we have to be careful. We have to be on guard. And so there's where we'll stop tonight. Next week, we'll finish Balaam here, and we'll get into Korah. I had an aunt whose name was Korah. And for the longest time, I thought, honestly, Korah was a woman. And then when I was a kid, I'm like, I hear the story. I'm like, oh, but no, just because my aunt was named Korah. But anyways, there's an interesting tidbit. Let's go ahead and break up into some groups. Break up into some groups if you would. And we'll go ahead and pray tonight. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming out. Pray over our